Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The Korean countryside in the mid-1980s was a place caught between two worlds, a landscape of profound and jarring contradictions. In the sprawling metropolis of Seoul, the miracle on the Han River was in full, roaring crescendo. Glass and steel skyscrapers clawed at the sky, a testament to a nation's ferocious will to rebuild itself from the ashes of war into an economic powerhouse. The city was a symphony of jackhammers and car horns, the air thick with the promise of modernity. The 1988 Summer Olympics were on the horizon, a grand coming-out party meant to announce South Korea's arrival on the world stage. But this narrative of progress was propped up by the iron fist of an authoritarian military government. Under President Chun Doo-won, student protests were brutally suppressed, and political dissent was a dangerous affair. It was a society surging forward economically while being held in a political stranglehold. Just an hour's drive south of this gleaming, tense metropolis, the world changed completely. Here, in the city of Hwaseong, the calendar seemed to have turned more slowly. This was not a city in the modern sense, but a vast agricultural expanse, a patchwork of small, isolated villages connected by unpaved farm roads and narrow footpaths. Life was dictated by the ancient, cyclical rhythm of the seasons, the planting and harvesting of rice. The landscape was one of serene, horizontal lines, endless rice paddies that shimmered like glass in the sun, low-slung hills, and dark, quiet irrigation channels that snaked through the fields. It was a place where tradition held sway, where neighbors knew each other's business, and where the deepest fears were of poor harvests or family misfortune, not of the darkness that lurked within men. It was a place that felt safe, an illusion that was about to be irrevocably and violently shattered. It is in this pastoral quiet that our story begins, because beneath the surface of this idyllic peace, something was stirring. A darkness was gathering, patient and predatory, and soon the name Hwaseong would no longer evoke images of golden rice fields and tranquil villages. It would become a byword for terror, for a mystery that would haunt a generation, and for a ghost who would walk unseen among its people for more than 30 years. This killer would become South Korea's first widely recognized serial murderer, a national specter as notorious as Jack the Ripper or the Zodiac. He would trigger the largest manhunt in the country's history, a desperate, sprawling, and ultimately futile effort that would consume over 2 million police man-days and see tens of thousands of men investigated. And for 3 decades, he would remain a phantom. Today, we dissect the anatomy of a decades-long cold case. We will explore how a killer exploited the vulnerabilities of a transitioning society and the technological limitations of an era. We will examine the anatomy of a failed investigation, one marked by desperation, immense pressure, and a tragic, catastrophic error that sent an innocent man to prison. And finally, we will uncover the anatomy of a scientific miracle, the story of how a microscopic trace of evidence, preserved for over 30 years, reached across time to unmask a monster who had become a legend. This is the story of the Hwaseong serial murders. The terror began on a cool autumn day, September 15, 1986. The victim was a 71-year-old woman, identified in reports by the surname Lee. She was returning from a visit with her daughter in a nearby town, a journey she had made countless times. She was last seen walking along a narrow path that cut through a field of tall eulalia grass. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the landscape. She never made it home. 4 days later, a farmer discovered her body. She had been discarded in a pasture, her lower body unclothed. The cause of death was determined to be strangulation. The local police force in Hwaseong was disturbed, but the crime was initially viewed as an isolated, albeit brutal act of violence. There were no witnesses, no discernible clues, and no obvious motive. It was an aberration, a tragic but contained event. They couldn't have known it was a prelude. They couldn't have known it was the first move in a deadly game by a predator who was just getting started. A little over a month later, on October 20th, the killer struck again. This time the victim was much younger. Park Hyun-suk was a 25-year-old woman who worked in an office. That evening, she had gone on a seon, a traditional Korean arranged blind date. Around 10 p.m., she was seen getting off a bus at a quiet rural stop, just a short walk from her home. It was a walk she had taken 1,000 times, but on this night, a shadow was waiting. Her family grew frantic when she didn't return. 3 days later, her body was found in a desolate irrigation channel, partially submerged in the murky water. The scene was far more disturbing than the first. Park had been brutally sexually assaulted. More chillingly, the killer had established what would become his horrific signature. She had been bound with her own clothing, her black stockings and underwear, in a complex, violent fashion, and she had been strangled to death. The two crimes, happening in such close proximity, both in terms of geography and time, sent the first real shockwaves of fear through the community. The police now understood they were not dealing with random acts of violence. They were dealing with a pattern. A hunter was in their midst. The winter of 1986 was cold and filled with a dreadful sense of anticipation. The Phantom of Hwaseong, as the media would soon christen him, seemed to favor the dark, the quiet, and the vulnerable. His hunting ground was the network of lonely roads and pathways that connected the small villages, places where a woman walking alone after sundown was an easy, isolated target. And as the year drew to a close, he claimed 2 more lives in rapid, terrifying succession. On December 12th, Kwon Jungbin, a 24-year-old homemaker, vanished on her way home from a bus stop. Her husband, worried when she didn't return, organized a search party. The next day, her body was found, not far from her home, discarded on a dirt embankment overlooking a rice paddy. Her hands were tied behind her back with her own stockings. A pair of her panties had been brutally stuffed into her mouth as a gag, a method of silencing that was both practical and deeply sadistic. She had been raped and strangled. The very next day, the killer struck again, in the same area. A 23-year-old company employee named Lee Kae-suk disappeared after getting off her bus. Her body was found in a ditch between rice paddies. Like the others, she had been raped, bound with her stockings, and strangled. The speed of the escalation was terrifying. 4 victims in less than 3 months. The killer was becoming bolder, more prolific. The police were utterly overwhelmed. In 1980s South Korea, this kind of serial crime was virtually unprecedented. The investigative techniques were not equipped to handle a killer who left so few clues and seemed to strike at random, without any personal connection to his victims. The concept of criminal profiling was in its infancy, if it existed at all in their playbook. The investigation was a massive, sprawling dragnet. Roadblocks were set up on the country roads, and officers began patrolling the rural paths at night. They questioned any man who looked remotely suspicious, who had a criminal record, or who was known for strange behavior. But it was like searching for a needle in a continent of haystacks. The killer was a ghost. He melted back into the community without a trace, a normal face in the crowd. The public, once feeling secure in their rural enclave, was now gripped by a collective state of terror. Women were afraid to leave their homes after dark. The simple act of walking home from a bus stop became a life-or-death gamble. Fathers and husbands would wait anxiously at bus stops to escort their wives and daughters home. A volunteer civilian patrol was formed, with residents arming themselves with sticks and bamboo spears, walking the paths at night, a testament to their fear and their loss of faith in the police. A strange legend began to circulate, a piece of folklore born from fear. The killer, people whispered, only struck on rainy nights. It wasn't strictly true. Some of the murders occurred on clear nights, but many did happen during or after rainfall. The rain would wash away footprints, suppress sound, and keep people indoors, leaving the country lanes deserted and his victims utterly alone. The sound of rain, once a soothing rhythm of country life, became an omen of death. Throughout 1987, the Phantom continued his reign. On January 10, 18-year-old Park Hyunju, a high school student, was found in a frozen rice paddy. It was a bitterly cold morning when a farmer made the discovery. Her hands were tied with her own scarf, and she had been gagged with a sock. The cause of death was, once again, strangulation. She had been sexually assaulted. This murder was particularly heartbreaking. A young girl, on the cusp of her adult life, snatched away. Her murder reinforced the chilling reality that no one was safe. Age was not a factor. The killer's only criterion seemed to be opportunity and vulnerability. He preyed on women of all ages, from teenagers to grandmothers. The pressure on the police was becoming immense. The national media was covering the case with breathless intensity. The government in Seoul, preparing to showcase a modern, safe Korea to the world with the upcoming Olympics, was demanding answers. The local Gyeonggi police force was seen as incompetent, unable to stop the slaughter. In response, they threw even more resources at the problem. A special investigation headquarters was established in Hwaseong, and the number of officers assigned to the case swelled into the hundreds. They began to collect what little physical evidence they could. At several crime scenes, they found semen samples, a crucial piece of evidence that held the killer's biological signature. But here, they ran headfirst into the technological wall of the 1980s. DNA fingerprinting, a revolutionary technology that was just emerging in the West thanks to the work of Sir Alec Jeffreys, was not yet a tool available to forensic investigators in South Korea. The best they could do was traditional serology, blood typing. From the semen samples, they determined the killer had type B blood. This was helpful, but only to a point. It could exclude suspects with other blood types, but a significant portion of the Korean population has type B blood. It allowed them to narrow a list of thousands down to a smaller list of hundreds, but it could not pinpoint a single individual. It was like knowing a suspect had brown hair, a useful detail, but hardly a smoking gun. This single scientific limitation would become the central tragedy of the entire investigation. They had the killer's essence, but not the means to read it. And worse, as they would discover decades later, even this fundamental piece of information was wrong. As the investigation floundered, the killer's methodology remained chillingly consistent. He was an organized predator. He seemed to stalk his victims, waiting for the perfect moment to strike from behind on a dark path. The bindings he used were almost always the victim's own clothing, stockings, pantyhose, bras, or scarves. This suggested a degree of forensic awareness, an effort not to leave behind foreign materials like rope. The sexual assaults were brutal and violent. The cause of death was always strangulation, an intimate and terrifyingly personal method of killing that requires sustained, close contact. He was a sadist who reveled in the complete domination and terror of his victims. On May 2, 1987, the sixth victim, a 30-year-old homemaker named Park, was found on a hill covered in pine trees. The details were tragically familiar. Bound, assaulted, strangled. The community of Hwaseong was living in a state of siege. The murders were no longer just a police matter. They had become a deep, weeping wound on the national psyche. The killer was more than a man. He was a symbol of a deep-seated anxiety, a fear that the rapid modernization of the country was leaving behind a moral vacuum, a darkness that the old ways could no longer keep at bay. The ghost of Hwaseong was not just haunting the rice paddies. He was haunting the soul of a nation. The investigation grew more and more desperate. With no forensic breakthroughs and no witnesses, police began to rely on more aggressive and ultimately more destructive tactics. They rounded up thousands of local men for questioning. The interrogations were often brutal. Suspects were beaten, deprived of sleep, and subjected to intense psychological pressure to confess. The police were under a political microscope, and they needed a culprit, any culprit, to stop the public panic and political fallout. This desperation created a fertile ground for a catastrophic miscarriage of justice, one that was brewing just beneath the surface of the chaotic manhunt. Then, for a period of over a year, the killings stopped. A tense, uncertain silence fell over Hwaseong. People wondered if the killer had died, moved away, or perhaps been incarcerated for another crime. A fragile sense of hope began to return. But it was a false dawn. On September 7, 1988, just as the world's attention was turning to Seoul for the Olympic Games, the killer returned with a vengeance. The body of 54-year-old Ahn Ji-soon was discovered in an irrigation canal. The modus operandi was the same. The phantom was back. The message was clear. He was still out there, and he could strike whenever he chose. The terror, which had briefly subsided, returned with a vengeance. It was the next murder, the eighth in the official series, that would become the most infamous and tragic chapter in the entire investigation. On September 16, 1988, 13-year-old Park Sang-gi was sexually assaulted and murdered in her own bedroom. This crime was different from the others. It was the first to occur indoors, a shocking escalation from the lonely paths and fields. The killer had slipped into the house while the girl was asleep, her parents in the next room. The brazenness was astounding. He was now confident enough, arrogant enough, to enter a home. The nation was horrified. The pressure on the police reached a breaking point. They had to catch him. In their frantic search, their attention fell upon a 22-year-old man named Yoon Sung-gyo. Yoon was a small-time machinery repairman who lived in the area. He had a limp from a childhood bout with polio, which made him stand out. He was poor, uneducated, and socially awkward. In the eyes of the desperate police, he fit the profile of a social outcast, a perfect scapegoat. They brought him in for questioning. What followed was a nightmare of state-sanctioned torture. For 3 days, Yoon was subjected to relentless, brutal interrogation. He was deprived of sleep, kicked, and beaten with batons. He later testified that officers took turns torturing him, keeping him awake under bright lights, refusing him water. The police, convinced of his guilt, were determined to extract a confession by any means necessary. Finally, broken and exhausted, his body and spirit shattered, Yoon confessed. He signed a document admitting to the murder of 13-year-old Park Sang-gi. The evidence against him was flimsy, to say the least. It consisted almost entirely of this coerced confession. Police claimed to have found a pubic hair at the scene that was similar to his, a scientifically meaningless comparison. But armed with his signature on a piece of paper, they declared the case solved. They held a triumphant press conference, announcing the capture of the Hwaseong killer. There was a collective sigh of relief across the country. The monster had been caught. Yoon Sung-gyo was put on trial. He immediately recanted his confession, telling the court in detail how he had been tortured. His pleas were ignored. The court accepted the confession as valid. In 1989, he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. The police were hailed as heroes. But there was a terrible problem. The real killer was still out there, and he was about to prove it. While Yoon Sung-gyo sat in a prison cell, the murders continued. In November of 1990, a 14-year-old middle school student named Kim Mi-jing disappeared on her way home from school. Her body was found a few days later in a hilly, wooded area. She had been bound with her own black stockings and bra. Her hands were tied behind her back. In a display of extreme, horrific sadism, a ballpoint pen, a fork, and a spoon had been brutally inserted into her body. The savagery was escalating. This murder, the 9th in the series, was a horrifying confirmation of what some had already suspected. The police had the wrong man. The real Hwaseong killer was still hunting. This crime scene, as gruesome as it was, would yield the most important piece of evidence in the entire case, though no one could know it at the time. Forensic investigators collected a sample of the killer's DNA from the victim's underwear. They still couldn't analyze it fully, but they meticulously preserved it, cataloging it, and storing it away in the hope that future technology might one day unlock its secrets. It was a single, microscopic clue, a silent witness waiting patiently in the dark for science to catch up to its truth. At the same time, the investigation did have one fleeting, tantalizing breakthrough. After the 7th murder, which occurred on a rainy night, a bus driver and a female bus conductor came forward. They remembered a suspicious man getting on their bus shortly after the time of the murder, near the crime scene. He was in his mid-20s and soaking wet, even though it hadn't been raining heavily. His clothes had mud on them. Crucially, he had no bag or umbrella, which was strange for someone out on a rainy night. He sat quietly, his hands smelling of dirt. Working with a sketch artist, the police created the first and only composite sketch of the Hwaseong killer. The image became iconic. It showed a man with a slender build, between 165 and 170 centimeters tall, with a sharp nose and piercing single-lidded eyes. The sketch was plastered on posters all across the country. It appeared on television screens and in newspapers. This face became the face of fear in South Korea. But despite its widespread distribution, it led to no arrests. The man with the piercing eyes remained a phantom. The description matched thousands of men. The killer simply blended back into the population, an anonymous face in the crowd. The 10th and final official victim was a 69-year-old woman, Kwon Soon-song, who was found in April of 1991 near a wooded hill. She had disappeared after getting off a bus. Like the others, she had been raped and strangled with her own stockings. After this murder, the killings abruptly stopped. The ghost of Hwaseong vanished as suddenly as he had appeared. The years began to pass. 1991 turned into 1992, then 1995, then 2000. The case grew colder with each passing year. The massive investigative headquarters was eventually disbanded. The detectives who had worked themselves to the bone on the case, like the legendary Detective Park, retired or moved on, forever haunted by their failure. The Hwaseong murders faded from the headlines, but never from the public consciousness. It became a piece of modern folklore, a chilling campfire story that was all too real. It was the ultimate whodunit, a national obsession. The case inspired plays, television shows, and most famously, the critically acclaimed 2003 film Memories of Murder, directed by Bong Joon-ho. The film masterfully captured the frustration, the desperation, and the dark, haunting ambiguity of the case, ending with the detective staring directly into the camera, as if looking for the killer in the audience. The film cemented the Hwaseong killer's status as a legendary boogeyman and brought the tragic case to international attention. In 2006, the statute of limitations for the final murder expired. It was a legal formality, but it felt like a final defeat. It meant that even if the killer were to be identified, he could no longer be prosecuted for his crimes. The case was officially closed. The ghost had won. He had gotten away with it. For the victims' families, it was a profound and permanent injustice. For the police, it was a legacy of failure. And for Yoon Sung-gyo, it was a life sentence for a crime he did not commit. A man forgotten by a system that had been so desperate for a resolution that it had sacrificed an innocent life. The silence from the fields of Hwaseong seemed permanent. But science, unlike memory, does not fade. It advances. The microscopic sample of DNA, carefully preserved from the underwear of the 9th victim, Kim Mi-jing, was still sitting in a forensic lab. For decades, it had been inert, a message in a bottle that no one could read. But technology was catching up. By the late 2010s, DNA analysis techniques had become exponentially more powerful than they were in the 1980s. Scientists could now use methods like polymerase chain reaction or PCR to amplify incredibly small amounts of genetic material, making billions of copies from a single strand. This amplified DNA could then be analyzed using short tandem repeat or STR profiling to create a unique genetic fingerprint. In 2019, more than 30 years after the 9th murder, the Gyeonggi Nambu Provincial Police Agency decided to revisit some of their highest-profile cold cases. They had a new weapon, the latest generation of DNA technology. They sent the old evidence from the Hwaseong cases, clothing, hair samples, and the crucial DNA sample from Kim Mi-jung's underwear, to the National Forensic Service for re-examination. It was a long shot. The evidence was old and degraded, but it was the only shot they had. In July of 2019, the forensic scientists at the NFS got a hit. The DNA from the 9th victim's underwear matched a profile in the National DNA Database. The database contained the DNA of all convicted felons in South Korea. The ghost, after 33 years of silence, finally had a name: Lee Chun-jae. The name meant nothing to the public. He was not a notorious criminal. He was a 56-year-old man who was already in prison. He was serving a life sentence, but not for the Hwaseong murders. He had been convicted in 1994 for the rape and murder of his 18-year-old sister-in-law. The crime was brutal. After a fight with his wife, who had left him, he invited her younger sister to his home. He drugged her, raped her, and then bludgeoned her to death with a hammer, hiding her body. He had been caught, convicted, and had been quietly serving his time in a prison in Busan ever since. He was, by all accounts, a model prisoner. The revelation was a seismic shock. The police had their man. But the profile was baffling. During the original investigation, Lee Chun-jae had been questioned by police. He was one of the thousands of men brought in, but he had been quickly dismissed. Why? Because of a critical, catastrophic police error. His blood type was O. The police had been so certain the killer's blood type was B, based on an early and apparently flawed forensic test, that they had let the real killer walk right out of the police station. He had been under their noses the entire time. The police now had a name, but they needed a confession. The The statute of limitations had expired, so they couldn't prosecute him for the Hwaseong murders. But they needed to know the truth. They needed to provide closure for the families and for the country. They assembled a team of veteran detectives and criminal profilers and began to interrogate Lee Chun-jae in his prison cell. For the first few sessions, he denied everything. He was calm, polite, and steadfast in his innocence. The investigators were skilled, using modern psychological techniques rather than the brute force of the past. They didn't threaten him. They showed him respect. They spoke to him as a fellow human being, appealing to his ego, his narcissism, his desire to be the one who held all the secrets. And they showed him the evidence. They laid out the DNA reports, the cold, hard, scientific proof that linked him not just to the 9th murder, but as new tests confirmed, to the 4th, 5th, and 7th murders as well. They had him, and he knew it. Over the course of 9 interviews, the dam broke. Lee Chun-jae began to talk, and the story he told was more horrific than anyone could have imagined. He calmly confessed to all 10 of the Hwaseong murders. He described each one in chilling detail, providing information that only the killer could have known, details police had kept from the public. He spoke without emotion, without remorse, as if recalling trips to the grocery store. He told the police they had been foolish. He described seeing the famous composite sketch of himself on television and thinking it was just a drawing, bearing no resemblance to him. He had lived in Hwaseong for most of the killing spree, working at an electric company. He was married and had a son. He was a seemingly ordinary man, a neighbor, a co-worker. He was the ghost who had walked among them. But he didn't stop at the 10 official murders. He confessed to 4 other murders that police had not connected to the case. And he confessed to more than 30 rapes and attempted rapes. The scale of his predatory life was staggering. He had been a one-man crime wave, a monster hiding in plain sight. He told police he had kept the watch of one of his victims, the 14-year-old Kim Mi-jing, as a souvenir, a memento of his crime. He didn't offer a real motive. He simply said he did it to satisfy his desires, that an impulse would come over him, and he would act on it. He showed no understanding of the gravity of his actions or the pain he had caused. His confession solved one of the biggest mysteries of the case. Why did the killings stop in 1991? Lee Chun-jae explained that he had moved away from Hwaseong that year to the city of Cheongju after his company relocated. It was that simple. He left his hunting ground, and the killings there ceased. He continued his predatory behavior in his new city, culminating in the 1994 murder of his sister-in-law, the crime that finally put him behind bars. He had been stopped not by brilliant police work, but by his own escalating recklessness. The confession brought a sense of resolution, but also a deep sense of national shame and anger. It laid bare the devastating incompetence of the original investigation. The reliance on brutal interrogation, the tunnel vision regarding blood type, and most tragically, the wrongful conviction of Yoon Sung-gyo. Confronted with Lee Chun-jae's detailed confession to the 8th murder, the police and the courts had to face a terrible truth. They had imprisoned an innocent man for 20 years. Yoon Sung-gyo was released from prison in 2009 on parole, having served 2 decades for a crime he didn't commit. But he was still a convicted murderer in the eyes of the law, living under a cloud of suspicion. Lee's confession was his path to redemption. He filed for a retrial. In December of 2020, the court formally overturned his conviction and declared him innocent. The judge bowed before him in the courtroom, offering a profound apology on behalf of the entire judicial system. the head of the Gyeonggi Nambu Provincial Police Agency, also bowed deeply before the cameras and formally apologized to Yoon, to the victims' families, and to the entire nation for the failures and abuses of the past. Yoon was awarded over $2 million in compensation for the years stolen from him, but no amount of money could ever give him back his youth, his reputation, or his life. Lee Chun-jae, protected by the expired statute of limitations, would never stand trial for the Hwaseong murders, but he would also never be free. He will spend the rest of his natural life in prison for the one murder that did stick. His confession was not an act of remorse, but an act of supreme ego. He told investigators he confessed because the crimes were bound to be disclosed someday, and he thought it was only right that I reveal the truth. In his twisted mind, he was the author of the story, and he wanted to write the final chapter. The case of the Hwaseong serial murders is, in the end, a story about time. For 3 decades, time was the killer's greatest ally. It allowed memories to fade, evidence to degrade, and statutes of limitation to expire. It was the passage of time that allowed a ghost to remain a ghost, a phantom who terrorized a community and then simply vanished, leaving behind a legacy of fear and unanswered questions. He benefited from an era when science was not yet powerful enough to see him, and when police work relied more on brute force than on careful deduction. He was the perfect predator for his time and place. But time, in the end, also became his enemy. The anatomy of this cold case is the anatomy of a scientific arms race. While Lee Chun-jae sat in his prison cell, a model prisoner, the world outside was changing. Science was relentlessly moving forward. The microscopic specks of biological material he left behind at his crime scenes, once indecipherable, became a Rosetta Stone. Time preserved the evidence, and technology finally provided the key to unlock it. The case demonstrates a profound truth. While human systems can fail, while confessions can be coerced, and while justice can be perverted, the physical evidence, the silent witness, does not lie. It simply waits. The fields of Hwaseong are quiet now. The dirt paths have been paved over, and the small villages have grown into suburbs. But the memory of the terror that gripped this place for 5 long years remains etched into the landscape. The resolution of the case did not erase the pain of the victims' families, nor did it undo the injustice suffered by Yoon Sung-gyo. But it did accomplish one crucial thing. It took a legend, a boogeyman born of fear and uncertainty, and it gave him a face and a name. The ghost who haunted the rain-soaked fields for a generation is a ghost no longer. He is a man in a cell, a testament to the fact that while justice can be delayed for a lifetime, the truth preserved in a single microscopic strand can wait forever. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.